Wouldn't you just love to plug into a dreamy podcast that would put you into a deep sleep almost as soon as the story began? If you don't care at all about watching a video, even if it has beautiful images, and you would just rather be getting into bed, closing your eyes, and falling into a deep sleep within minutes, Sleepy Tales of Lore understands. Craving sleep is the reason we are here, and we provide the experience in any way you prefer it most, whether you enjoy watching our videos or just listening. And, in keeping with our channel theme of yarns of myths and legends passed down through the ages, tonight we offer something new. Native American lore, narrated by a Native American elder, titled The White Buffalo and the River of Stars. Now, just get comfy and relax as our story begins.
Now there was once a land so wide and so old that the sky above it never felt small. The great plains of the Lakota stretched outward in every direction, farther than any eye could follow, farther than any story had yet thought to travel. The grasses ran in long and living waves, bending and rising with the wind, and the wind itself moved through them with the patience of something that had never been in a hurry, not in all the ages of the world. The earth here was not simply ground beneath the feet. It was a presence, breathing and aware, holding within it the memory of every season that had ever passed across it, every storm, every thaw, every long and golden autumn that had slowly given way to the first cold breath of winter. The Lakota people understood this in the way that one understands a thing not taught, but felt. Deep in the chest, deep in the quiet places behind the eyes, deep in the soles of the feet where they pressed against the living ground. To walk this land was to walk inside a conversation, one that had been going on since long before the first human voice had spoken a word. The meadowlarks knew one part of it. The thunder knew another. The river bends and the low hills and the dry creek beds in late summer, each of them held their own chapter of something vast and unhurried and good. The people of the plains had learned to read all of it. They had learned that the way the grasses bent in the morning told a different story than the way they bent at dusk. They had learned that the silence before a storm and the silence after a storm were two entirely separate silences, each one asking something different of the person standing inside it. And they had learned, above all things, that the world was not made of rock and soil alone, that beneath every visible thing there moved something deeper, something that could not be touched but could be known, something that lived in the space between the seen and the unseen, the way a breath lives in the space between sleeping and waking. This was the world in which the story lived, a world of immense and quiet wonder, of skies so wide they made even sorrow feel small, of nights so full of stars that the darkness between them seemed generous rather than empty. A world where the animals and the people and the land itself were bound together in something older than language, something that asked always to be honored and remembered. It is important to say all of this before the story begins, because a story is not simply a series of events. A story is a place, and before you enter a place, it is good to stand at its threshold for a moment, to breathe the air of it, to feel the light of it, to let your eyes grow accustomed to what is here. The plains are patient. They have been waiting for you. Step in now, gently and without hurry, and let the story begin. In the next section, a morning unlike any other arrives on the plains, and an entire herd of buffalo has vanished without a single trace left behind. Now, in the season when the frost first breathes across the tall grass, when the mornings arrive with a pale and silver coldness that hangs in the air like something half-remembered, the hunters of the camp rose before the sun as they had always done. They wrapped themselves against the chill without speaking much. The fire had been banked the night before and still held a faint warmth, enough to take the worst of the cold from their hands before they stepped outside into the dark. The walk to the high ridge took perhaps an hour at the pace they moved, steady and unhurried, reading the land around them as they went. A fox had crossed the path sometime in the night, heading east. A rabbit had paused at the edge of the brush and then moved on. The grasses held their stories quietly, waiting for eyes that knew how to receive them. For as many years as the oldest hunter could remember, and he was a man who had lived through more winters than he cared to count, the great buffalo herd had gathered each autumn on the low ground beyond the ridge. It was as certain as the geese heading south or the first ice forming on the still pools near the river. It was a thing that simply happened, as reliable and as good as sunrise, as the return of the swallows in spring. So when they crested the ridge and looked down at the empty ground below, the stillness hit them like something physical. Not merely the absence of movement, not merely a herd gone temporarily elsewhere. Gone, completely, utterly, impossibly gone, as though 10,000 animals had been lifted from the earth and carried away by something that left no footprint behind. The men stood in the pale gray light and said nothing for a long time. The sky above them was the color of ash, that particular shade of pre-dawn gray that makes the world feel suspended, waiting for permission to begin. The wind moved through the empty grass below with a low and hollow sound, a sound that had never seemed mournful before and now could not seem like anything else. One of the younger hunters walked down the slope and crouched at the edge of where the herd should have been. He pressed his palm flat against the earth and held it there. Then he stood and shook his head slowly. The ground was cold. No warmth remained, not the warmth of 10,000 great bodies standing close together through an autumn night. It was as though the herd had not been here in some time, or perhaps had never been here at all. There were no tracks, no flattened grass in the familiar great circles, no scent of musk on the air, no dried dung at the edge of the hollow. None of the 10,000 small signs that a herd of that size leaves behind simply by being somewhere. The land was as clean and as still as a held breath, and that stillness pressed against the ears of every man on that ridge like deep water. Among the hunters that morning was an elder named Chaitan. His name meant falcon, and like the falcon, he had always possessed a quality of vision that went slightly beyond what ordinary eyes could find. He had lived through enough seasons to have watched the patterns of the world, its repetitions, its rhythms, the way certain things that seemed extraordinary were simply the ordinary world doing something it had always done, something that only looked strange because it had not been seen for a generation. But this was different. Chaitan stood on the ridge for a long time, longer than the others, long after the younger men had begun to speak quietly among themselves, their voices tight with something that wanted to become worry. He stood with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes moving slowly across the empty ground below, and he did not look afraid. He looked intent, the way a hawk looks before it folds its wings and falls. At last he sat down on the cold ground, as though the ridge itself had asked him to settle for a moment. He placed both hands on the earth, not searching for warmth now, but offering something, a kind of listening through the palms, a question sent downward rather than outward. And after a silence that the younger men did not dare to interrupt, he said quietly and with great certainty, "We must listen now more than we speak." No one argued with this. No one added to it. They turned and walked back toward the camp in the growing light, and the empty plain watched them go with an expression that, had anyone been able to read it, would have looked very much like patience. In the next section, the night falls, and old Chaitan lies down to sleep, and the dream that finds him is unlike anything the waking world has ever offered. That night, Chaitan did not sleep the way ordinary men sleep. He had learned, over the long years, that there was a difference between letting sleep take you, the way a current takes a leaf, pulling it along without ceremony, and choosing to enter sleep as one enters a sacred space, with intention, with openness, with the understanding that what waited on the other side was not emptiness, but presence. He banked his fire low and sat before it for a time, watching the coals breathe. Orange and red and deep gold, colors that had no names equal to their beauty. He let his breathing slow, let the tensions of the day settle downward through him, the way silt settles in still water, slowly, completely, until the water above it is clear. Then he lay down, and he let the darkness come. The dream, when it arrived, did not arrive the way most dreams do, gathering in fragments, shifting and uncertain. It arrived all at once, fully formed, the way the sun arrives over the ridge on a cloudless morning, complete and unmistakable and warm. He was standing on the plain, but it was not the plain as he knew it in waking hours. The grasses were silver, not gray, not pale, but truly silver, as though each blade had been touched by a light that came from within rather than from above. They moved in a wind he could not feel, swaying with a slow and deliberate grace that made them look less like grass and more like something breathing. The sky above was not black as night skies are. It was a deep and luminous blue, the kind of blue that does not exist in daylight, the kind that has no name because language has never needed one until now. It pressed downward gently, the way a hand presses gently on a shoulder, not in restraint, but in comfort, in the quiet assurance that something steady and good was close by. And across this luminous world, moving slowly along the far horizon, something white. It moved the way buffalo move, with that rolling, unhurried heaviness that is its own kind of grace, that quality of presence that makes a buffalo seem not merely large, but elemental, as though it is made of the same substance as the hills and the river and the sky, as though it has simply chosen for a while to be this particular shape. But it was alone. And it was white, white as new snow before any foot has touched it, white as the inside of a cloud when you are inside one and the world outside has disappeared. White as the moment just before understanding arrives, that still and luminous pause before the heart says, "Yes, I know this now." It did not come toward him. It moved across the horizon with a steady and unhurried purpose, the way stars move, always in the same direction, never pausing, never uncertain. And as it moved, Chaitan understood, without being told, without the arrival of any word or voice or sign, that this was not simply an animal. It was a door. It was an invitation. It was a question that the plains had been asking the people for a very long time, longer perhaps than any elder alive could trace, and it was asking now whether they were still listening. Chaitan stood in the silver grass and watched the white shape move along the edge of the world, and he felt in his chest something he could only describe afterward as recognition, not of something new, but of something so fundamental and so old that feeling it again was like hearing a song that you have hummed your whole life without knowing where it came from. The white buffalo moved on. The silver grasses swayed. The luminous blue sky pressed gently downward. And somewhere behind the dream, the way a fire's warmth can be felt through a wall, something enormous and benevolent held the whole of it steady. Chaitan woke before the first light, that absolute blackness that comes in the hour before dawn, when night has gone as deep as it will go. He lay still, keeping the dream close the way one keeps a coal alive in cupped hands. He did not move until he was certain he had held every detail of it, every color, every quality of light, the exact way the white shape had moved, and what it had felt like to watch it. Then he sat up, and the word was already in his heart, already there, as though it had always been there, and the dream had simply reminded him of what he already knew. Private Skawin, the white buffalo, the sacred messenger, she had come. In the next section, the council of elders gathers by firelight, and the oldest among them speaks of a promise made at the beginning of time. The council fire was lit before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. There was an understanding among the Lakota that certain conversations required their own particular light, not the clean and democratic brightness of midday, but the intimate, shifting warmth of a fire, a light that revealed some things and softened others, a light that was itself a kind of participant in whatever was spoken within its circle. The elders arrived one by one, settling into their places with the unhurried ease of people who had spent their lives learning that the body itself knows when to rest and where to be. The fire crackled softly between them. A raven called once from somewhere beyond the camp and then went quiet. A dog lifted its head, considered the darkness, and put its chin back down on its paws. Chaitan spoke without preamble, but also without urgency. He described the dream the way you describe a landscape to someone who has never seen it, carefully, with attention to the details that matter, not rushing toward the conclusion, but letting the shape of the thing reveal itself as he went. The silver grasses, the luminous blue of the sky, the white shape along the horizon. The feeling, that recognition, that had moved through him like something coming home. When he finished, the council was silent. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who have too much, and who understand that the way to honor a large thing is not to immediately fill the space around it with words. The fire spoke instead for a while, snapping and settling, sending a bright thread of spark up into the cool morning air, watching it fade to nothing against the lightening sky. An ember shifted. The warmth pressed outward through the circle of seated figures. There were 7 elders at the fire that morning. 4 men and 3 women, and among the women, one who had lived so long and seen so much that the others leaned slightly toward her when she was in the room, the way compass needles lean toward north. Her name was Winona, a name that means firstborn, and she was the eldest of the 7 by many years. Her face held its age not as diminishment but as accumulation, line upon line of season and weather and feeling, each one a mark left by something that had been fully lived. Her eyes were dark and very still, the way deep water is still, not empty, but composed, holding everything beneath the surface without agitation. It was Winona who spoke first, not immediately, but when the silence had done its work and the moment was ready. Her voice was quiet, genuinely quiet, not softened for effect, but simply worn that way by age, so that those around her had learned over the years to lean in when she opened her mouth, because what came out was never wasted. She said that in her own grandmother's time, a story had been passed along. Not written down, it was not that kind of story. It was carried in the mouth and in the heart, the way the important things always are, traveling from one person to the next, the way a fire travels from one torch to another, always the same fire, always new. The story was this, that long before the memory of the oldest living person, the white buffalo calf woman had walked among the people, that she had carried a sacred pipe of red stone, and that she had taught the people the ceremonies that bound them to all living things, not as a gift given once and then complete, but as a covenant, an ongoing agreement between the people and the world they lived within. And that before she left, transforming as she walked away, from woman to white calf, to black, to brown, to red, each color a season of the world. She had made a promise that she would return, that when the world needed remembering, when the bonds that held things together had grown thin with forgetting, she would come back. Winona spoke all of this very quietly, not looking at any one person but at the fire, as though she were telling the story to the fire itself, letting the fire carry it outward in all directions, the way fire does. When she finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, with a certainty that required no argument and invited none, "Perhaps the herd has not gone away. Perhaps it has gone ahead, to show us the direction we are meant to walk." The fire settled lower. The first birds began their morning conversation in the brush beyond the camp. The sky above was turning from gray to the particular pale gold that comes just before true dawn, that color that seems to arrive not from any direction, but from everywhere at once, as though the whole of the sky is gently deciding to be morning. One by one, the elders nodded. Not in performance, not for one another's benefit, but with the small and private nod of people who feel a truth settle into place inside them, the way a stone settles into earth that has always been shaped to receive it. There was no debate. There was no vote. There was only the fire and the morning and the quiet understanding that what was asked of them now was not to think harder, but to move. In the next section, 2 young men are chosen for the journey, and the preparations are made in the way of things that matter, slowly, carefully, and with great attention. Now there is a way of choosing that the Lakota understood well, and it is not the way of competitions or arguments or the loudest voice in the room. The best person for a sacred task is not always the strongest or the fastest or the most decorated by past victories. Sometimes the best person is the quietest, the one whose presence does not disturb the air around it, the one who can move through the world without leaving it agitated in their wake. 2 young men were named before the morning fire had burned to ash. The first was Takoda, a name that meant friend to everyone, and he had earned that name not by being agreeable or pleasant in the easy surface way, but by possessing a genuine quality of attention toward every living thing he encountered. He watched the world the way one watches something beloved, carefully, gratefully, without the intention to change it. He was perhaps 25 years of age, old enough to have learned something of himself, young enough to still be capable of real surprise. He had dark, level eyes that gave the impression of depth without distance, a man you could speak honestly to, a man who would receive what you said without immediately deciding what to do with it. The second was Kohana, which meant swift, and he was swift, genuinely so, with a quality of movement that reminded people of water finding its level, not hurried, not effortful, simply efficient in the way that natural things are efficient. He had grown up hunting and had spent enough time alone in the open country to have become fluent in its languages. The language of wind direction, of animal behavior, of light, changing on the grass as a storm approached from the west. Together, these two made a pair that the land could trust, and that above all was what the journey required. The preparations took the better part of the morning. Not because there was much to carry, both men understood that a sacred journey is not helped by excessive provisions, but because each thing that was packed with intention, considered carefully before it was folded and placed into the bundle. Dried meat, enough for several days if eaten modestly. Water carried in a vessel sealed with pine resin. A single blanket each, thickly woven against the cold of the open plain at night. A small fire kit wrapped in oiled leather, not for comfort, but for ceremony, for the moments when the day needed to be acknowledged and the night needed to be honored before it settled. And from Winona's own hands, pressed into Takoda's with a grip that was still surprisingly firm for her age, a small bundle of sage. Dried and tied with a thread of red, the bundle was perhaps the length of a man's hand. Winona held Takoda's gaze for a moment as she gave it to him, and in that moment she communicated something that no word was quite the right size for, a transmission of trust, of understanding, of the knowledge that he would know when the time came to use it. He folded his hand around the bundle and nodded. She nodded back. It was enough. The camp gathered quietly to see them off. Not in celebration, there was no drumming, no ceremony of farewell, because what the men were undertaking was not a departure, but a continuation, an extension of the community's purpose into the country beyond the ridge. They were not leaving. They were going on behalf of everyone who stayed. Children watched from their mothers' sides with wide and curious eyes. Old men straightened slightly as the two young figures passed. A woman at the edge of the gathering pressed both hands flat against her own sternum for a moment. A private gesture of sending, of goodwill offered without expectation of return. Takoda and Kohana walked north and then turned west at a place where a particular stone marked the edge of familiar territory, a gray stone the height of a man's knee, rounded by weather into something almost gentle in its shape. Takoda touched it briefly as he passed, not for luck, but in greeting, in acknowledgement of something that had been standing at this threshold for longer than anyone living could say. Then the camp was behind them, and the plain opened forward, endlessly, generously, in the way that only the great plains know how to open, as though the horizon itself is a gift continuously given. In the next section, the two men move deeper into unknown country, guided by something that cannot be seen, only felt, and the land around them begins to change in ways neither has words to describe. The first day was long and quiet and good. They walked at the pace the land invited, not fast, not slow, but at the natural gait of men who are paying attention, who are receiving as well as traveling, who understand that the journey itself is as much the purpose as the destination. The grass moved around their legs with a dry, whispering sound, a sound that was not unlike the sound of something being said in a language just at the edge of comprehension. Takoda was aware from the first hour of the warmth at the center of his chest. It was not dramatic, it did not blaze or announce itself. It was simply there, the way the North Star is there when you look for it, steady and reliable, asking nothing except that you orient yourself by it. When he walked in one direction, the warmth was present and even and clear. When he drifted slightly off course, as he did twice in the first morning without meaning to, it became something more like an absence, a faint and neutral cooling, nothing urgent but enough to notice. He would adjust his direction, and the warmth returned as steady as before. Kohana felt it too, not in his chest but lower, in the abdomen, a pull rather than a warmth, subtle and consistent, the way a current can be felt in deep water even when the surface is still. Neither man mentioned it at first, not from reluctance to speak, but from an instinct that saying it aloud too early would be like opening a door before you are sure you are ready for what is on the other side. By midday, they had crossed into country that was familiar in the way that all plains are familiar. Grass, sky, the occasional shallow depression where water gathered after rain, but that had a particular quality to it that Takoda found difficult to name. It was as though the air here was cleaner, not cleaner in the simple sense of fresh or uncontaminated, but cleaner in the way of something that has been recently attended to, recently honored. As though the land here had been spoken to more recently than usual. They stopped in the early afternoon where a line of low willows indicated a seep, a place where underground water moved near enough to the surface to sustain the roots of things that needed more moisture than the open plain provided. They drank and rested without speaking much, and in the silence both men became aware of how full the quiet was here. Not empty quiet, not the silence that comes from an absence of life, but the particular fullness of a place where many living things are simply going about their business without being disturbed. A yellow warbler moved through the willows above them with a quick and purposeful energy. A ground squirrel emerged from a hole nearby, regarded them with bright and skeptical eyes, and retreated. A dragonfly, impossibly blue, impossibly precise in its movements, hovered for a moment over the seep and then was gone. "The land feels awake here," Kohana said finally, and it was the first full sentence either of them had spoken in several hours. Takoda considered this for a moment. "The land is always awake," he said. "Here it is simply watching." The second day brought a change in the quality of the light. It was subtle at first, a certain luminosity at the edges of things, a sharpness in the way shadows fell, the kind of visual quality that photographers would not have words for until many generations later, and that the two men could only experience as a feeling. The feeling of being in a place where the usual membrane between the visible and the invisible had grown thin. The warmth in Takoda's chest had deepened. It was no longer simply a compass, it had become something more like a feeling of imminence, of something large and good drawing close, the way the air changes before rain, not threatening, not alarming, but different enough from the ordinary that every sense grows sharp and willing. Kohana had grown very quiet. He walked with his eyes moving constantly, not searching in the tense way of a man who expects danger, but in the open, wide way of a man receiving everything the landscape is offering. He reminded Takoda of a bowl held up to rain, simply open, simply willing. The afternoon of the second day, the terrain shifted, subtly at first, and then with increasing conviction. The plain began to curve, the horizon developing a new texture, the suggestion of hills, low and rounded, to the north and west. Between them, a shadow that might have been a valley, or might have been a trick of the light at this particular hour. Takoda watched the shadow grow more certain as they walked toward it. The warmth in his chest had become almost a sound, not something he heard with his ears, but something he felt in the bones of his face, a resonance, a vibration at a frequency that had no name. And then the grasses ahead of them moved, not with the wind, which was still, but of their own accord, a long, slow wave that traveled outward from some central point beyond the ridge ahead, as though the land itself were taking a breath. In the next section, the two men crest the final rise, and what they find in the valley below stops them where they stand and takes every word from their mouths. The rise was long and gentle, not a dramatic climb, but a gradual lifting of the earth, the way a deep breath lifts the chest, steadily and without effort. They walked it slowly, both men feeling now the full weight of where they were and what was about to be asked of their eyes and their hearts. Takoda counted his steps without meaning to, a habit of journeys, the mind doing something with its hands, while the rest of it prepares for something too large to prepare for. Kohana's hand was near his medicine bundle, not gripping it, not holding it, just close, the way a hand is close to something it loves, without needing to hold it constantly to know it is there. They reached the crest, and they stopped. The valley below them was unlike anything either man had ever seen, and both of them had spent their lives in country that most people would have already called extraordinary. But this was something else entirely. This was a valley that seemed to exist at a slightly different angle to the rest of the world, as though it had been placed here with great care and deliberateness, as though the hills on either side of it were not geographical features but intentions. It curved between two long and gentle ridges like something cupped. The word that arrived in Takoda's mind was not landscape or terrain or valley, but palm, a cupped palm, the way a person cups their hands to hold water or to receive something small and precious from someone they trust. Through the center of the valley ran a river. Not a large river, not the great rivers that carved through the plains with the authority of old decisions, but a quiet, unhurried river, moving through the valley floor with the ease of something that had been doing this for so long that it had become part of the shape of things. But the way it caught the light. It was late afternoon, that hour when the sun is low enough to cast its light at an angle that makes everything it touches look as though it has been there forever, as though it is seeing what it was always meant to look like. And the river in this light was not simply reflecting, it was holding the light the way deep water holds the warmth of summer long into autumn, keeping it, nurturing it, giving it back slowly and generously, and with a quality that was warmer and more complex than what it had received. And there, in the valley, at the river's edge and across the grass and up the gentle slopes on either side, the herd, all of it, every animal, 10,000 or more. It was impossible to comprehend with the ordinary counting mind, impossible to hold as a number. It was like trying to count a forest or measure a sky. The numbers fell apart in the face of the actual presence of the thing. They were not grazing. They were not moving, not jostling, not doing any of the 100 small ordinary things that a herd of buffalo does simply by being alive and together. They were still, every one of them, standing or lying in the valley with an attitude that the only word for was waiting. Not the anxious waiting of something that wants to be elsewhere. The deep and patient waiting of something that is exactly where it intends to be. Takoda and Kohana stood on the ridge and did not move for a very long time. It would be inaccurate to say that they were simply looking. Looking implies a kind of separation between the one who sees and the thing seen, a distance maintained. What they were doing was something closer to receiving, allowing the fact of the valley and the herd and the river to enter them without resistance, without the editorial commentary of the thinking mind. They were, without any formal ceremony, praying, not with words, with attention, which is, when it is given fully and without agenda, the same thing. Below them, one of the great dark heads lifted, a bull near the edge of the herd, and turned in their direction. He regarded them for a long moment with dark, unhurried eyes. Then he turned away again, as though he had confirmed something he already knew and could now return to the business of simply being. Kohana exhaled slowly. It was the first sound either of them had made since cresting the ridge. The sound of a man releasing something he had been holding longer than he knew. The sun continued its long, slow descent toward the western hills, and the light in the valley deepened, warmed, grew more golden by degrees, as though the valley itself was slowly, deliberately turning up a lamp. In the next section, the sun reaches the horizon, and from the center of the great herd, the white buffalo emerges, and everything the world contains goes quiet around her. As the sun touched the very edge of the horizon, that precise and sacred moment when it is neither fully up nor fully gone, when the boundary between day and everything that comes after grows permeable and soft, something changed in the valley below. It was not a sound. It was not a movement in the ordinary sense. It was more like a shift, The way the quality of a room changes when someone significant enters it, before any word is spoken, before anyone looks up. Something in the air itself rearranging around a new and considerable presence. The herd parted. Not in the way a herd parts from a predator, with alarm, with the rolling thunder of thousands of hooves finding their direction all at once. But the way a river parts around a stone it has been flowing beside for 1,000 years, with ease, with familiarity, with a kind of collective grace that spoke of deep and wordless understanding. From the center of that parting, she came. The white buffalo walked the way mountains walk, which is to say, she did not walk so much as she arrived, steadily and completely, bringing with her the full weight of her presence, as though she were not entering the valley, but revealing what the valley had always contained. She was not larger than the other animals, not in the simple, measurable sense of length and height and weight. It was something else that made everything around her seem to settle more deeply into the earth, made the light in the valley seem to concentrate around her movement, as though it too wanted to be close. Her coat was the white of things that are white in themselves rather than white by absence of color, not pale, not washed out, but luminous, holding within it a quality that made the late afternoon light look ordinary by comparison. She moved through the parted herd, and every animal she passed became more still, not from fear, but from the same impulse that makes a person stop speaking when music begins, out of respect, out of recognition that something more important is happening. Takoda found that he could not form a coherent thought. Not because his mind had gone empty, it had not, but because what he was seeing was of a size and quality that ordinary thinking was simply not the right tool for. He stood on the ridge and he felt instead, felt the warmth in his chest expand until it was no longer in his chest but everywhere, felt something in him that had been quietly clenched for years without his knowing it, slowly, completely release. Kohana had tears on his face and could not have said when they began. He did not wipe them away. They moved down his cheeks in the cool air of the late afternoon, and he let them go without attending to them, because attending to them would have required looking away from what was in the valley, and that was not something he was willing to do. The white buffalo walked to the edge of the river. She stood there for a moment, her head up, her stillness so complete that even the grasses around her feet seemed to have stopped moving. Then slowly, with an unhurried grace that was itself a kind of teaching, she lowered her great head and drank. Where she drank, the river seemed to brighten. Not dramatically, not in the way of fires or explosions or anything that would have alarmed the watching men, but in the way of something very good being added to something already good, a deepening of quality, a strengthening of whatever it was the river had always been, as though the act of her drinking was also an act of blessing, of affirmation, of a covenant being renewed between this living water and everything it would go on to nourish. The sound of the river seemed to change too, subtly, barely at the edge of hearing, as though the water were now carrying a frequency it had not carried before, something below the threshold of language, but above the threshold of the heart. Takoda heard it with the center of his chest. Kohana heard it in the soles of his feet where they stood against the dry grass of the ridge. She drank for a long time, and the valley was still, and the last of the sunlight was warm and golden on everything it touched, and the sky above was beginning the long, unhurried business of becoming evening, deepening, softening, filling the upper reaches with the first suggestion of the stars that were waiting on the other side of blue. In the next section, the white buffalo turns and sees the two men on the ridge, and what passes between them is the most important conversation either will ever have, one in which no words are spoken at all. When she had finished drinking, the white buffalo raised her head and turned, fully, deliberately, toward the ridge where Takoda and Kohana stood. She could see them. This was beyond any doubt. She was looking directly at them specifically, in the way that only a being possessed of deep intelligence and intention can look at another being. Not the flat, reflexive awareness of an animal registering a nearby presence. Recognition. And in her eyes, which were dark and very large, and held within them something that the word calm is too small for, the way a single candle is too small for an enormous room, and yet is not the wrong thing to bring. There was no alarm, no wildness, no readiness for flight. She regarded them the way the oldest things regard the younger ones, with patience, with a kind of steady, encompassing affection that did not require proximity to be felt, with the full and unhurried acknowledgement that they were here, that they were seen, that their being here mattered in a way that was woven into the larger pattern of things rather than added on top of it. Takoda did not move, not from fear, but from the same instinct that makes one not move inside a perfect moment, the understanding that stillness is the most respectful response to certain kinds of grace. The white buffalo held the gaze for a time that was long enough to feel sacred and brief enough that he was not certain afterward how long it had actually been. Then she did something neither man expected. She lowered herself to the ground at the river's edge. Slowly, by degrees, that great weight finding the earth in the way that truly enormous things find the earth, not falling but choosing deliberately to rest. First her front knees, then the rest of her, settling with a kind of inevitable completeness, as though the ground had always held the exact shape of her. As she rested, the rest of the herd settled too. 10,000 animals lowering themselves into the grass across the floor of the valley. It was a sound like a sigh, like the exhalation of something that has been standing for a very long time and has finally been given permission to let go. The stars had begun. First one, then three, then uncountable, appearing in the deepening sky above the valley one by one, and then in clusters, the way the very best things arrive, gradually at first, almost tentatively, and then all at once, everywhere. Takoda reached slowly into his bundle and brought out the sage that Winona had given him. His hands were very steady. He did not need to consult Kohana. There was nothing to consult. Some moments carry their own instructions, and this was one. He lit the bundle from the small fire kit at his side, the flame catching easily as though it had been waiting, as though the sage had been ready for this particular evening since the morning it was tied. He held it in cupped hands and let the smoke curl upward, gray and sweet and unhurried, rising into the still evening air, carrying with it a prayer that he did not speak aloud because it did not need to be spoken. The prayer was gratitude. Simple, complete, containing everything. Gratitude for the dream that had set this in motion, for the elders who had known how to interpret it, for the land that had carried them here, for the river that brightened when she drank, for the stars coming out above the valley, for the herd lying down in the blue evening like 10,000 quiet promises kept. When the smoke had thinned to nothing, Takoda looked down and saw it. At the base of the ridge, in the grass at the very foot of the slope, a single white feather, resting as though it had always been there, as though the wind had carried it from somewhere between the worlds and set it down with care at exactly this place, at exactly this moment, as a signature might be set at the bottom of an agreement between two parties who trust one another so completely they do not need the signature but provide it anyway, out of love, out of thoroughness, out of the desire to make the invisible visible. Kohana descended the ridge first, moving quietly, and picked up the feather with both hands. He held it for a moment in the growing dark, and Takoda watched him from above, and neither man spoke. Down in the valley, in the blue and starlit grass at the river's edge, the white buffalo breathed slowly at rest, her great sides rising and falling with a steadiness that was its own kind of music, its own kind of reassurance, a rhythm that said, plainly and beautifully, and without any need for translation, all is well. All is held. Nothing has been forgotten. In the next section, the two men return to their people, and the story they carry back with them moves through the camp like light, and everything it touches is gently changed. Now the story begins to settle, the way the land itself settles in the hours after sunset, slowly, deeply, with a great and generous exhale. Takoda and Kohana returned to their people as the next day's sun was climbing, warm and unhurried, taking its time about the business of morning, as if it knew that what was about to happen deserved a good light to happen in. They arrived to a camp that was already awake and already watching for them, not with anxiety, not with the tight and restless attention of a community that fears bad news, but with the open, upward-turned watching of people who had spent the night in their own kind of trust, who had prayed in their own ways and received in the night their own small assurances, and who had risen this morning with the quiet certainty that what had been sent out into the world had been received by it. Winona was standing at the edge of the camp when they came over the last rise. She did not move to meet them. She simply stood and watched them approach, and her expression was the expression of someone who sees confirmed something they already knew, but are glad to have confirmed nevertheless. Takoda brought the feather to her first, before he spoke a single word, before he ate or drank or sat down. He walked to her and held it out, and she received it in both hands with a gravity and a tenderness that made everyone watching hold their breath for a moment. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Takoda and Kohana in turn, and in each look she gave them something, a recognition, a confirmation of what they had been and done and seen, of who they had been in the face of something much larger than themselves. Then she said simply, "Tell it." And so they told it, sitting at the community fire with the morning sun on their faces and the camp gathered around them in the concentric rings of people who want to be close to something true. They told the whole of it. The warmth in the chest and the pull in the belly, the land growing more awake as they walked, the valley no one had named, the cupped palm of it, the river holding light, the herd in the valley still and waiting, the parting of the animals, the white buffalo walking through them like something the world had always been preparing for, her drinking at the river, the brightening of the water, the way she turned and saw them, truly and completely saw them, and the thing that passed between her eyes and their hearts in that exchange, which none of them would ever find full words for, and none of them would ever stop trying. Her settling to rest, the herd following, the stars coming out above the valley, the sage smoke rising, the feather at the foot of the ridge, resting in the grass as though left there on purpose, which it was. The story moved through the camp like sage smoke moves through an open space, quietly, pervasively, touching everything it reached with a quality that altered the air without replacing it. The children who were too young to understand the words felt it as something warm. The hunters who had stood on the empty ridge 2 mornings ago felt it as resolution, the completion of something that had been open and aching. The elders received it the way they always received great things, with silence, and then with a small nod, and then with silence again. Because the best response to something true is not to elaborate on it or to immediately fill the space around it with commentary, but to simply let it stand in the room and be what it is. Winona, when the telling was done, was quiet for a long time. Then she said the thing she had said the morning before, but now she said it differently, not as a possibility, but as a confirmation, not as a reading, but as a fact, now written into the community's living knowledge. She came to remind us that we are not alone in this world, that the animals do not simply endure alongside us, they are in covenant with us. And a covenant requires tending, every season, every generation, always. The herd, by late afternoon of that same day, had returned to the familiar ridges and meadows, not in a dramatic procession, not in any way that announced itself or required acknowledgement. simply present again, the way the grass is present, the way the sky is present, as though they had never been gone but had only gone deep for a while and were now returned to the surface of the world. The feather was wrapped in soft red leather and cedar and placed in the care of the council, not as a relic, not as a trophy, not as evidence of something that needed proving, but as a reminder. A small and white and weightless reminder that the world is larger than the daily round of it, that within the seen world there moves always an unseen one, and that the unseen one is not distant or indifferent, but close, attending, caring, returning when called, returning even before it is called, because it has always been watching and has never, in all the long ages of the world, looked away. Now let the story settle. Let it move down through you, the way warmth moves down through a body that has finally found rest, from the top of the head, through the shoulders, through the chest where the warmth lives, through the length of the arms and the quiet hands, down through the body and the legs, all the way to the soles of the feet until you are warm throughout, entirely and gently warm. Picture the plains now, in the deep and starlit dark of a night without wind. The grasses are still, every blade at rest. The river moves through the valley below with a sound so soft it is more suggestion than sound, a whisper of water over smooth stone, carrying its cold and living presence through the sleeping land without disturbance. The herd is lying down, all of them, across the valley floor, across the low slopes, in the soft hollows where the grass grows thickest. Their breathing rises and falls, slowly, slowly, a rhythm as old as the land itself. In and out, in and out. Let your own breath find that rhythm now, if it wishes to. There is no effort in it. Simply the long, unhurried breath of a body that is safe, that is held, that is resting inside something larger and more patient than worry. At the river's edge, where the water catches the starlight and holds it, the white shape rests. Still, breathing, present. Her great sides rising and falling with the same slow and sacred steadiness, the same breath that has been moving through this world since before the first word was spoken, since before the first fire was lit, since before the first story was told by a human voice to other human ears in the dark. The stars are very close tonight. They lean down toward the valley with a patient and ancient curiosity, as though they too wish to be near whatever is at rest by that river, as though even they, who have watched this world since the beginning, find themselves drawn to the warmth of it, to the gentleness of it, to the way the white buffalo breathes in the dark and makes the whole of the sleeping land feel tended. There is nothing to do now. There is nothing to tend to, nothing to solve, nothing to carry forward from this moment into the next. This moment asks only one thing, and that thing is stillness. The willingness to be where you are, exactly as you are, inside the dark and the quiet and the warmth. The grasses do not worry about tomorrow's wind. The river does not hurry toward its destination. The stars do not count the hours until morning. and the white buffalo at the water's edge does not stir. She simply rests and breathes and is here, fully, completely, sufficiently here. You too are here, fully, completely, held by the same dark that holds the valley, the same quiet that holds the herd, the same patient and enormous goodness that has been holding this world since the beginning of it and will go on holding it long after the last story has been told. Let your eyes grow heavy now. Let the last of the day's thoughts drift away like sage smoke into a dark and open sky, rising, thinning, gone. The plain breathes around you. The stars watch over all of it. The white buffalo rests. And the night, deep and patient and full of everything that is good, wraps itself around the world like a gift that asks for nothing in return. Sleep now. The story knows where it ends. And it ends here, in the dark, in the warmth, in the slow and endless and sacred breathing of the plain.